Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. I am just an old lad that is trying hard to get by. Okay, let's dive into the story. There's something about being alone in a house that makes every little sound seem magnified. When you're surrounded by others, the creaks and groans of an old house fade into the background, barely noticeable. But when it's just you, those sounds become louder, more persistent, almost as if the house itself is trying to catch your attention. That was on my mind the night it all happened. I was 16, and my parents were out for the evening, leaving me alone in our house by the woods. It wasn't the first time I'd been left alone, but something felt different that night, something I couldn't quite pinpoint. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that makes you feel utterly alone in the world. My homework was spread out on the kitchen table, but I wasn't really focused on it. The TV in the living room was on, casting a soft glow across the room, and I could faintly hear the sound of a sitcom playing in the background. Outside, the night had fully set in, and the world beyond the windows was cloaked in darkness. Our house backed onto a thick forest, with trees that pressed in close like silent sentinels. During the day, it was a beautiful place to lose yourself in nature, surrounded by the scent of pine and the rustle of leaves. But at night, those same trees transformed, becoming a wall of blackness where anything could be hiding just out of sight. I wasn't scared, not really. I was used to the woods and the way they seemed to close in around the house at night. But as I sat there idly tapping my pen against my notebook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with a sound, a faint, distant noise that barely registered at first. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper, and listened. Nothing. Just the usual creaks of the house, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the laugh track from the TV in the other room. I shrugged it off and went back to my homework, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct, a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the woods. I set down my pen, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to listen. The voice was distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but I could sense the urgency in it, the way it seemed to reach out, begging for someone to listen. "Help! Please help!" I frowned, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It didn't sound like something ordinary, just someone in trouble. But the woods were dense, thick with underbrush and uneven terrain. Definitely not a place you'd wander into by accident, especially not at night. I stood up and moved to the window overlooking the backyard. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the same dark shapes of the forest, the same stillness that had always been there. But the voice didn't stop. "Help!" It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, growing louder with each repetition. My first instinct was to run outside, to see if someone needed help, but something held me back. There was something off about that voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too faint, too distant, as if it wasn't really coming from the woods at all, but from somewhere else entirely. "Help!" I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone really was in trouble? But the more I listened, the more I felt that gnawing sense of unease, like something wasn't right. Finally, I made up my mind. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, my hand trembling slightly as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the backyard as I stepped outside. The night was cold, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the voice had stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting to hear it again. But the woods were silent. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. I should have gone back inside. I should have locked the door and forgotten about it. But something compelled me to move forward, to take a few tentative steps toward the edge of the woods. "Help!" The voice was louder now, closer, like it was coming from just beyond the tree line. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept moving, my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, there was no response, and then the voice came again, clear and sharp. "Help me, please." It was so close now, so real that I almost believed it, almost. But there was something wrong with the way the voice echoed through the trees, something unnatural about the way it seemed to bounce off the trunks and come from every direction at once. I stopped, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I pointed it into the woods. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to go inside and lock the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. I stood there frozen in place, the flashlight casting a jittery beam of light across the trees. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I was about to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the house, when I heard a new sound, rustling in the bushes just ahead. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, the beam illuminating the darkness. For a moment I saw nothing, just the same dark shapes of the trees, the same tangle of underbrush. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, barely visible in the shadows. My heart lurched in my chest and I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, so intense that I almost dropped the flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was it? What did they want? Why were they just standing there, hiding in the darkness? And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing where the voice had come from, but it hadn't moved. It had been there the whole time, which meant the voice hadn't been moving through the woods. It had been coming from that exact spot, as if the figure had been calling out to me. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but there was something wrong with the way it was standing, the way its body seemed to blend into the shadows like it wasn't entirely there. I knew I had to get out of there. I knew I had to turn around and run back to the house, but my legs felt like lead, my feet rooted to the ground as I stared at the figure, unable to look away. And then slowly the figure began to move, stepping forward just enough to come into the light. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a woman, or at least it had been at some point. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, hollow pits. Her hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her clothes were tattered, clinging to her thin frame like rags. But it was her expression that terrified me the most. She was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across her face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face, the kind of smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through my entire body. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and completely alien, she spoke. "Help me!" I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just turned and ran. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I sprinted back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the rustling behind me, the sound of something moving through the bushes, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the back door, fumbling with the handle as I threw it open and practically hurled myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands, and backed away, my eyes fixed on the darkness outside. For a moment I stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The house was silent, the only sound the rapid thudding of my heart in my ears. But then I heard it again, the voice right outside the door. "Help me, please." I backed away, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had just seen her in the woods, just heard her calling out from the trees. How could she be here so close, so fast? I grabbed the phone from the counter, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a lifeline, a connection to the real world that I clung to desperately. "There's someone outside my house," I stammered, my voice barely steady. "I don't know who it is, but they're trying to get in. Please send someone." The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as I waited, every second stretching out like hours. I could hear the voice, still calling out from just outside the door, but I refused to go near it, refused to look out the window.
"Help me!"
The words were like a broken record, repeating over and over, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The voice stopped abruptly, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. But when I looked out the window, the backyard was empty. The police arrived minutes later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the area. I told them everything about the voice, the figure in the woods, the way she had appeared so suddenly, so impossibly close to the house. They searched the woods, combing through every inch of the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was like she had never existed at all. The police stayed for a while, trying to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me, not really. They thought I had imagined it, that I had let my mind play tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. After they left, I locked every door and window in the house, my hands still trembling. The fear hadn't left me. It was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making me jump at every little sound. I kept expecting to hear the voice again, to hear it calling out from the darkness. But the night was silent. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the light, anything to make it seem less real. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that something had been in those woods that night, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I knew that it had been calling out to me. I've moved away from that house, away from those woods, but the fear never truly left me. It's a part of me now. I know that whatever was out there in those woods is still waiting, waiting for someone else to hear its call. Okay, now relax and enjoy the second story. It was supposed to be a laid-back night. My parents had gone out for a dinner party, leaving me home alone for the first time in what felt like forever. I was a teenager, finally trusted enough to hold down the fort by myself, and I was looking forward to it. No siblings to bother me, no parents telling me to turn off the TV or do my homework. Just me, a bowl of popcorn, and hours of uninterrupted video games. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone else is gone. It was comforting at first, a peaceful silence that made the whole place feel like it was truly mine. I settled into my favorite spot on the couch, game controller in hand, and lost myself in the pixelated world on the screen. But as the hours ticked by, that silence started to feel different. The clock on the wall ticked louder, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became more pronounced, and every little noise the house made caused my heart to skip a beat. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make noise, and I was just being paranoid. Besides, I was having fun, and I wasn't about to let a few creaky floorboards ruin my night. But then, just as I was about to finish a particularly tough level, something caught my eye. Movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the game on the glass, a trick of the light that made it look like something was moving outside. But when I glanced over, I saw it clearly, a figure sitting on the deck. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The deck was right outside the living room window, visible from where I was sitting, but the figure was positioned so that I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, hunched over, almost as if they were waiting for something. I paused the game, my hands suddenly clammy around the controller. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a prank on me, or a neighbor who had wandered over. But then, as I watched, the figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of their face. It wasn't anyone I knew. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure was a man older than me, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short, dark hair and was wearing a plain hoodie, the hood pulled up to obscure most of his face. But what I could see was enough to send a chill down my spine. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, but a wide, unsettling grin that stretched across his face, as if he found something incredibly amusing. His eyes were fixed on the house, but they didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. Just staring, unblinking. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. This wasn't normal. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't supposed to be here. I considered going outside, confronting him, but something held me back. There was something about the way he was sitting there, so still, so silent, that made me feel like I shouldn't get any closer. Instead, I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and moved to the window for a better look. The man didn't react, didn't even seem to notice me. He just kept staring ahead, that eerie grin never leaving his face. And then he started to laugh. It was a strange laugh, barely audible through the glass, but I could see his shoulders shaking, his chest rising and falling with silent chuckles. There was no sound, just the movement, like he was laughing at a joke only he could hear. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't just some random guy. It was someone who clearly wasn't right in the head, and he was sitting on my deck, laughing to himself. I took a step back, my mind racing with what to do next. My parents weren't going to be home for hours, and I didn't want to call them and freak them out unless it was absolutely necessary, but I couldn't just ignore this either. I decided to lock the doors. At least that way, if he tried to come inside, he wouldn't be able to get in. I moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I locked the front door, then the back door, making sure every window was securely shut. The whole time, I could feel the man's presence on the deck, that silent laughter echoing in my mind. But when I returned to the living room to check the sliding glass door that led to the deck, my heart nearly stopped. The man was standing right up against the glass, his face inches from the door. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table as I scrambled away from the door. The man was still grinning, his hands pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging up the window. I could see him more clearly now, the pale, sickly tone of his skin, the dark circles under his eyes, in that grin. It was like he was enjoying this, like he knew exactly how terrified I was and was relishing every second of it. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to put as much distance between myself and that door as possible. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching me, his eyes tracking my every step. And then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. My breath hitched as I realized what he was trying to do. He was going to come inside. I bolted for the door, reaching it just as the handle started to turn. I yanked it back, locking it with trembling hands just as the man pulled on the handle from the other side. For a moment, we were face to face, separated only by the thin pane of glass. I could see the amusement in his eyes, the twisted pleasure he was getting out of this. He tugged on the door again, harder this time, but it held firm. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was he going to do next? Would he try to break the glass? Was he armed? I didn't know, and the uncertainty was almost worse than anything else. But then, to my surprise, the man let go of the handle. He stepped back, his grin widening as he tapped the glass with his finger, like he was playing some kind of game. And then he laughed again, a soundless, eerie laugh that made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic I felt. I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out in a rush, almost incoherent. There's a man on my deck trying to get inside. He's just standing there laughing. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. I stayed on the phone, my eyes glued to the crack under the door, half expecting to see shadows moving outside. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the man broke in before the police arrived? What if he wasn't alone? But then, just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside, followed by loud knocks on the front door. "Police! Open up!" I almost cried with relief. I unlocked my bedroom door and ran to the front door, throwing it open. 2 officers stood there, their faces serious, but the sight of them made me feel like I could finally breathe again. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, his voice calm but urgent. I nodded, still shaken. He was on the deck, trying to get inside. The officers exchanged a glance, then one of them motioned for me to stay inside while they checked the perimeter. I watched from the doorway as they moved around the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when they returned, their expressions were grim. "We didn't find anyone," one of them said. "Are you sure he was out there?" I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of fear. "He was right there at the door." The officer sighed, glancing at his partner. We'll file a report and have someone keep an eye on the area tonight. But if you see anything else, anything at all, call us immediately." I nodded numbly, the reality of what had happened finally sinking in. The man was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The police stayed for a while, making sure the house was secure and taking down my statement. They tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a vagrant or someone playing a prank, but I could see the concern in their eyes. When they finally left, I was alone again, the silence of the house now oppressive. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the living room, to face the sliding glass door where the man had been standing. Instead, I stayed in my room, every little noise making me jump. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, those dark, soulless eyes staring back at me. I kept imagining him coming back, finding a way inside, and what would happen if he did. When my parents finally came home in the early hours of the morning, I practically ran to them, blurting out everything that had happened. They were horrified, of course, but by then it was too late. The man was gone, and there was nothing they could do. We called the police again, but they found no trace of him, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked past the living room, I felt the urge to look out at the deck, to make sure it was empty. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, never leaving anything to chance. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get that man's face out of my mind. That twisted grin, those silent laughs. It was like he had etched himself into my memory, a reminder that no matter how safe I thought I was, there was always something out there, waiting to find a way in.